second?
Yes, just
all right.
Oh, hold on. Let me start.
All right. Well, I want to welcome everybody here this afternoon. Happy Wednesday afternoon to you. If you're wondering if you're in the right time and the right place, this should answer that. You are, regardless of what you thought you were looking for, you are in the right time and the right place. So we want to welcome you to the Critical Business Updates for Business Owners call for Eastern Colorado. Those of you who have been with us over the last several weeks are used to a regional format that would have a Northeast call and a Southeast call. And this is our first week combining those two. And so we thank you for joining us and for being nimble enough to change days with us as well. So I appreciate that. I think you're going to enjoy today's call. And for those of you who don't know me, I'm John Whitler with Ogallala Commons, and I lead our Grow Seco initiative in Southeast Colorado. And with that, those of you who don't know me are probably expecting to see Lisa Hudson, and so I'll just have her take it from here.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Wednesday, the new day for our regional call. So excited to have you here. I'm Lisa Hudson, the director of the East Colorado SBDC Small Business Development Center. Let's go to our next slide. So before we jump into our agenda, I'd just like to take a second to thank our sponsors for this call. All of these partners have worked so hard to bring you such a great lineup each and every week. First on the docket, Startup Colorado, the Office of Economic Development and International Trade, the Ogallala Commons, Grow Seco, the Civic Canopy, East Colorado SBDC, the Telluride Foundation, and the Northwest Colorado Small Business Development Center. So thank you to all of our partners as well as our presenters, panelists today. Let's go to that next slide. As you can see on the window here, we have a full agenda, just chock full of great information, wonderful panelists. So right off the bat, you heard from John as well as myself. Next up, we've got our national panel, will be moderated by Delaney Keating. And following that, we're going to have a local panel answer to what's happening in our backyard in Eastern Colorado. Is it following along those trends that the national panel described? And to follow that up, we're going to have a Q&A and wrap up by our director, Jamie, out of the Central Mountain SBDC. I do want to remind you all to please utilize that Q&A chat box, because if you've got questions or comments, we want you to be heard and we want to be able to respond to those. So do use that. And as our next slide comes onto the window, I'd just like to thank you all for being here today and welcome our moderator for the national panel, Delaney Keating, the Managing Director for Startup Colorado. So Delaney, I'm going to pass the torch to you at this time and we'll move to that next slide.
Thanks, Lisa. A quick note here that I've seemed to be hitting an untimely moment with a riding lawnmower. So I believe it will be done in just seconds, and I'll speak loud and clear, but please let me know if I'm having any issues being heard. Thanks to everyone for joining the call today. Before we start off, a special thanks to the Colorado Department of Local Affairs and the Colorado Main Street Program, and also Downtown Colorado Inc. For extra support in developing today's call topic. You can learn more about the resources these organizations offer at the end of the call. As we go into today's call, this first panel, I think something that's always good to help structure our minds when we're going to be talking about a very singular topic like Main Street. And we know that we're going to hear the word Main Street about 1,000 times today. Main streets are environments, built environments loaded with infrastructure, zoning, and codes, and we think of them with a lot of permanence. But Main Street is fundamentally an idea, a concept, and it's one we all agree is important. So I'd like to start us off today with a little exercise so that we can become Main Street explorers, especially during a time when some of our fears and tensions are running high. And in order to free our minds a bit and detach from our emotions or established notions of Main Street, I'm going to ask us to say it backwards. And if we say Main Street backwards, Main Street is Neum Terts. And Neum Terts become two new words begging to be defined. So say it out loud to yourself, do yourself that favor, find that new angle for something that feels old, that's always been with us for many decades. And let's explore Main Street together in the spirit of Neum Terts, at least for the next hour. Now, mind you, our panelists will be speaking about Main Street, but hopefully this can give us a little bit of freedom. This is something I started doing at Startup Colorado. As you can imagine, we say the word startup a lot, and it starts to lose some of its meaning when we say those words on repeat. Startup backwards is actually pootrats. So something that really helps me not take myself too seriously in needed moments. On a more serious note, as we dig into our conversation, pre-COVID and even more so today, we teeter on the potential for business to be a force for good in solving societal issues that philanthropy alone can't address. Impact investing, social enterprise, and the creative economy are several ways that we seek to bring business and philanthropy together. The root of a lot of these issues are a result of human nature, and we can't separate the people from the place. So this is where Main Street comes in. We may casually think of Main Street as our downtown or central business district, when in fact it is much more. Especially in small rural communities, Main Street is the intersection of business, art, and culture, and in many ways this makes it the center of a town. The dynamics and sustainability of it have been challenged for decades, and given our fears for Main Street and small business today, let's tune in with our panel to learn about how the pandemic may offer us a window of possibility. Joining us today, we have Bruce Katz, Beth Flowers, Leslie Schaller, and Kathy LaPlante. Bruce Katz is the founding director of the NOAC Metro Finance Lab at Drexel University in Philadelphia. Previously, he served as inaugural Centennial Scholar at Brookings Institution and as vice president and director of Brookings Metropolitan Policy Program. Katz previously served as chief of staff to the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development and staff director of the Senate Subcommittee on Housing and Urban Affairs. Katz co-led the Obama administration's Housing and Urban Transition team. He is co-author of The Metropolitan Revolution and the New Localism, How Cities Can Thrive in the Age of Populism. Also joining us is Executive Director Beth Flowers from the AIR Institute. Beth has more than 25 years of executive level experience with nonprofits, governmental agencies, broadcast media, and the arts. Beth is a national leader in the fields of art professional development, community development, and entrepreneurship. As the creator and director of the AIR Institute of Berea College, she is at the forefront of connecting artists and creatives to their communities in new ways that truly raise the value of art and creativity. We also have with us Leslie Schaller, Director of Programs at ACE Networks, the Appalachian Center for Economic Networks. Leslie has directed multiple training and technical assistance programs which assist micro entrepreneurs through small business development, contract services, and the formation of support networks of resource providers. She has also secured public and private funding through grants and fees for services to support regional initiatives, targeted sector training, financial management support, and capital access. Kathy LaPlante joins us as well from the National Main Street Center. She's the Senior Program Officer and Director of Coordinating Program Services, with expertise in building organizational capacity and developing promotional programming. She has worked in the Main Street field for nearly 25 years. She joined the staff of the National Main Street Center in May 2007, and she works throughout the US providing training for cities of all sizes using the Main Street approach to downtown revitalization. Prior to this position, she was hired as the first director of the New Hampshire Main Street Center and served in that role for over 10 years. I'm actually just realizing there's a slight adjustment to Kathy's bio here. She reminded us on our previous call today for Western Colorado, she has actually been with Main Street now for 30 years. So welcome to our panel. Thank you for joining us. Kathy, I'd like to start with you as we look at Main Street. Historically speaking, why and how are many of our main streets re-evolving post the 1980s to become an essential part of community?
Yeah, thanks for having me, and thanks for asking that question. Our National Main Street program has actually been around since 1980, so this would have been our 40th year to celebrate, although our national conference was canceled. It should have been actually this last week. Main streets are, from the time that they developed, main streets have been the heart and soul of our community. And while main streets were never all 100% retail, there was always service, government, civic, religious institutions in our downtowns. Those things still exist today. So like through the 80s, we really lost so much investment in our communities as strip centers and shopping malls opened up and a lot of retail left. We tried to react to that by modernizing downtown, by covering up our historic facades. Some people did pedestrian malls, trying to combat sort of the losses that happened there. But communities like all of yours in Colorado, and I've spent a few visits in Brush, so I know what their community is about and the issues that they've addressed, is really our main streets still are the home to our independent, more locally owned businesses than the national chains being in our district. We're still great mixed use districts, and being that heart and soul of the community, it's the place where we typically gather for community celebrations and parades. It's the place where we sort of experience community. And, that's the one thing I don't think that we'll ever lose, is really that this is the place where probably the most iconic historic buildings in your communities are also located on your main streets and in the heart of downtown. Those are the things that we cherish because we're just not building the type of historic structures that we have in many of our main street communities. I didn't mention it on the last call, but Leadville is one of those communities with the Tabor Hotel. There's just significant properties in our downtown, and we work really hard to protect those. So again, it's the heart and soul of our community. So why are we not protecting it? As you mentioned, Delaney, we've invested so much infrastructure in what's existing there. We should be working to protect it every day.
Yeah, that's great. As we look we look at those investments over several decades. These new retail models have hit main streets hard, and despite those investments both in time and money to reignite that downtown vibrancy, we definitely see a pattern of varied results across the country. I'd love to explore with the panel. Let's do a round of in just about 1 to 2 minutes, 2 minutes tops. But what is one example you've seen pre-COVID or that you're seeing today that stand out as successful in Main Street revitalization or adaptation? And I'd love to start with you, Leslie Schaller, on this.
So I think what we've discovered over the years in terms of our main streets is that what really makes the change is the entrepreneurs. They animate not just our communities, but really I would say, help the social communities, with social cohesion. And that's where I think many of us really focus on entrepreneurship. We've really looked at sector development. So figuring out what are those incredible assets within a community. Is it their history? Is it culture? Is it maybe arts or food? Or, what really separates that community from other communities in the region, and really focus on those assets. So, I know Beth will fill in some of the creative placemaking pieces here, but figuring out how to get all the stakeholders involved to really revive and allow entrepreneurs to lead the way and animate our main streets.
Yeah, that's Beth, I think that's a natural pass to you with some of your work. I know you and Leslie work in similar territories and have seen such a breadth of communities across the country yourself in the development of the AIR Institute. What things have you seen?
Well, to build on what Leslie said, I think it's the community sensibility and sense of pride that is really when you can tell that a main street is going to take off, is when there's a combination of not just the entrepreneurs, but also the artists and the schools, and a sense of real civic interest in Main Street that makes a difference. And I think that the news is that you can't do one or the other. You have to have a marketing campaign that is going along with whatever support, be it financial or programmatic, to Main Street, in order to really make sure that the community values and takes pride in what is happening on Main Street. And I think that combination of essentially storytelling of what makes our community unique, this is the place where we get to see it most clearly, is where our most unique small businesses pop up. Sometimes in places that aren't as fancy, but nearby that Main Street. And I think it's that connection that really helps strengthen the whole of Main Street.
Bruce, what would you add to that in your perspective in the work that you do? I know that you even sort of extend globally with work in the UK.
Well, I tend to focus, first of all, I agree with everything that people have said, but I tend to focus on institutions, intermediaries that have the capacity and the capital and the community standing to basically drive these very special and authentic places forward. So in a place like Cincinnati, that might be the Center City Development Corporation, backed by large corporate and philanthropic dollars in the Over the Rhine district. In West Philly, it might be a business improvement district, the University City District. In other places, it might be a community development corporation or a Main Street program. But intermediaries that are able to access particularly the private capital, it might be tax advantaged, to do the adaptive reuse of historic buildings and to ultimately provide a financial platform for the kind of programming that makes Main Street so successful.
And Bruce, that's a great segue into our next question. And actually, I think I'd be very curious your perspective on it, given your work. And so the audience knows Bruce's organization, the New Localism, they have put together several thought pieces recently around Main Street. And I very much encourage you to go to the New Localism and read those. They're very insightful, and that's how we found Bruce for this call. So you never know what you're going to unearth in a little research. But Bruce, Main Streets are, we know they're populated by businesses and creatives, but often managed by local government. So when we look at those other institutions that are at play in this environment, we know this creates an opportunity for different types of collaborative partnerships, public, private, nonprofit. And something I've started to sort of study myself for the last few years is that this also presents a behavioral dilemma. And where we champion creatives and entrepreneurs for taking risks and failing, we don't always do the same for our local governments or managing districts. We do know that historically, big government has played a key role in innovation. So I'd be curious, what line of advice would you give to an entrepreneur or local manager to catalyze and support those same risk behaviors within our more bureaucratic local structures?
Well, I think places are successful. I mean, what makes cities and communities so different from the federal government or the state governments is that cities and communities are not governments. They're really networks. And in some respects, some of the greatest power that local government has, particularly elected officials, is the soft power of convening private and civic and other stakeholders to design, finance, and deliver the kind of special districts and mix of uses and activities that really Main Streets represent. So Main Streets have a special pull on the sort of local zeitgeist. I mean, they really are the centers of commerce, but even more importantly, they're the centers of civic life and communal participation. So you may get a little more latitude when you talk about main streets and local government than many other areas of focus. But this network effect is really what makes cities and communities so powerful, and it's what distinguishes them and why they're less partisan and more pragmatic than national and state governments.
Thank you for that. What are our other panelists thinking? Feel free to jump in. What do you guys think about this? You know, how do we help catalyze more freedom to explore on Main Street at the local level? And what have you seen, Beth, Kathy, or Leslie?
Leslie and I can fight over who gets to talk about networks.
I was going to say, power to the networks. You know, I mean, I think, again, what we're seeing certainly in this crisis now, too, is how to pull all these stakeholders together. So having leadership at the elected level is wonderful, but they need support as well. And I think, you know, maybe we don't always have complete alignment in our values or our expectations, but I think if you look at specific needs or specific aspirations even within communities, and if you can come together, again, really making sure everyone has access, it's inclusive, it's transparent, and we sort of have that sense of what our North Star is, then I think we can move mountains in our communities, in our main streets. I mean, we're certainly seeing that, and many examples right now, just in my small business community, in a, you know, quintessential college town that has no college students at the moment. So, you know, businesses are trying to pivot and figure stuff out, but they want to do it together now because they've been engaged in networks and they respect and acknowledge, I think, the collective action that we need to take together.
I'll add to that and just say that, you know, one of what we always say on Main Street with R&D is rip off and duplicate, which is really educating those people. And I know that Colorado Main Street and Wyoming Main Street teamed up for a best practices tour that Wyoming does annually. And that's getting mayors, city councilors, even your state elected officials on those tours to get into your rural communities and show them what you're doing, show them what you're struggling with. And then on those rides, people learn and talk and then share and say, wow, if this town could do it, then I could do it in my community too. I think sometimes they're just caught up in the busyness of being government that we need to sort of push new ideas their way. And if we can show them by example, that's a great way to do it.
Another thing that I've definitely noticed in the work that I do that really focuses more specifically on rural is that when you don't have a lot of the intermediaries, it doesn't mean that there aren't things happening. And there are always players who are willing to step up. But I think what sometimes we assume is that we need a miracle and $1 million to get anything going. And I think the key that we're seeing to seeing Main Street succeed is to start small and to recognize that you never know where the energy is going to come from. And we assume it's going to come from some fancy business that may not even be from our town, but mostly it's from our town that our wonderful Main Street businesses and entrepreneurs are locally grown. And it's why those supporting them is so important early on. But I think that sometimes we get obsessed with chasing money a little bit too soon before we figured out our story and who we are in our own Main Street. And the more we can do the hard work that unfortunately it just takes people power of conversation after conversation to get people moving and actually moving into action to start that business or to buy that building. But it takes a local champion who isn't willing to give it up to really make things get started, particularly in rural communities.
And Beth, I'd love to hear too, because you lived in Colorado for many years when you actually founded the AIR Institute before spending the last almost decade, I believe, serving 7 states in Southeast Appalachia. What advice or what reflection do you have in the juxtaposition from the work you've seen between the East and out here in the West?
Well, what I think is most interesting is how many similarities there are. The biggest difference is actually the geographic spread between communities. People live closer together out east, but mountain towns are mountain towns, and extractive industry that can wipe out a town's economy happens even in Colorado, as we all know. And so there are lots of similarities. And I think what's most interesting is how important the local culture is of every community. And the communities that succeed are the ones who dig in deepest to what makes them unique, what makes their community tick, what funky, interesting, arty stories do they have to tell that start to really express themselves. And I think that's similar in Appalachia and in the Intermountain West as well. But Delaney and I have also talked about how there are certainly differences. And I think the economic distress in Appalachia is much deeper. And it is a hurdle that is very, very steep in comparison to places where, I lived in Fort Collins for 13 years and our population nearly doubled in that 13 years. That's not happening in Appalachia, although this is a moment when those population changes are actually potentially happening. And it's something that means that our main streets are even more important right now, particularly in rural America, because we're seeing population shifts. And if we don't have the ability to collaborate and figure out how to organize our main streets and also protect our culture, we have the danger of really seeing our communities shift quite drastically.
Thanks for that, Beth. It's great to have that perspective, and remember that in Colorado, we're really part of a larger story in terms of our rural towns and rural challenges sweeping as they sweep across the country, and to really look at our rural strengths. I'd like to close out with this question. You'll each have about 30 to 45 seconds to answer. And I'll start with you, Bruce, because I believe you have a hard stop here at the half hour. But how is the pandemic opening the door to lasting change in how we design and govern Main Street?
Well, I think the pandemic is going to have a dramatic effect on the size and scale of many, many small businesses in the United States, particularly those that are co-located along main streets. And I think what could happen in the aftermath of this is we may need different kinds of intermediary structures and different kind of financing. So we've called for something called a Main Street Regenerator, that in main streets that have lost businesses or have businesses that have less revenue than they normally would have because of health protocols, this regenerator would essentially provide common services, starting with deep cleaning, technology access, back office, et cetera, and also help repopulate some of the vacant buildings and might even take an ownership position on some of the real estate. So there is a bill by Senator Booker and Senator Daines called the Relief for Main Street Act that would allow for these kinds of new intermediaries to receive federal support in this transition phase. So this could lead to different kinds of Main Street programs and Main Street intermediaries.
That's great. And so our audience knows, I will drop links to the bill that Bruce just pointed to in the chat here shortly, along with an article that addresses this kind of call for regenerators. Pointing back to you, Leslie, what would you add to that? What is your big possibility inside of the pandemic?
Well, I think some of us oldsters like me, we've gone through some twists and turns in terms of economic disruptions. And, COVID is certainly a whole new thing. and affecting us in so many different ways than maybe recession or depression. But I think what we've got to do is reimagine what recovery looks like. And we need to be exerting, I would say, more collective groupthink and control as to what we want our communities, our main streets, our way of connecting with one another to be. I mean, climate change is also on the horizon, folks. Many of us in rural places are, really contemplating how rural in-migration, might make some changes within our communities as well. So let's recover, but let's do it in a way that, especially in Appalachia, creates a just economic transition.
That's great. Thank you. How about you, Beth?
Well, to build off that theme, I think adaptation rather than recovery is how I've been trying to think about this, is that we're not going back. This is a new world that we're in, and that means that we get to make it. And so there is a real opportunity for us to work together, collaborate, do some really deep listening. That's going to require all of us to get better at listening, and use design thinking to really define what we value. And I think this is an opportunity for us to really support the wonderful things that Main Street has always offered. And really get a chance for us to own it in a little bit different way, both literally and figuratively as well. As Bruce mentioned, I think there are new economic models that we can look at, but I think the transparency and the equity and the local control is still paramount in my mind about any sort of financial changes, is making sure that intermediaries are not just sort of becoming the new version of the company town, and that there really is clear local control on how investments are being made and how decision making is actually happening along the way. Because there's so many opportunities for us to grow new kinds of businesses, and honestly, new kinds of models for so many things where we can share. And in rural, that is so much more important because we just don't have the access to a lot of things. So we have to share differently than we have.
Yes, and I think there's so much sharing and collaboration going on. Kathy, really quickly, 30 seconds. What possibilities are you guys exploring at the National Main Street Center in terms of programming?
Yeah, we're looking at a lot of shorter term things right now. We're having communities get in touch with their own community because recovery is going to be different, or adaptation for each community based on their feeling of their comfort to go back to downtowns and what needs to happen there. So selling through e-commerce platforms is something that we're working with communities on. There's also surveys that show us older volunteers are staying away, so we need to focus on youth in our communities to help see us through. We're looking at, changing our marketing for downtown. There are no immediate plans for big events anywhere, so we have to be more to a niche market, doing a lot more smaller events, but gives us some opportunities to open up sidewalks and streets for people to do different things. We have to make sure that downtown still retains that heart and soul and that people feel safe coming. Longer term, I think there's going to be a return to rural, get out of the cities, but then we have to start addressing things like 5G and fiber optics and making sure our rural communities are set up for that.
Great, and that's a great point you make. I've had a personal hashtag for the last couple of years that was hashtag rural is the new urban. So I think there is a return to small experiences, small communities, small business, from the macro to the micro, which perfectly points us towards the second half of our call today as we zoom in from the land of Neum Turts and Main Street at a national level to what's happening with our local players and the people who do the work here in Colorado every day. If you're on the call, national panelists, if you remain on the call, there will be Q&A here towards the end. I do see some questions coming in, so to the extent that you remain, that would be helpful. Otherwise, for people asking questions, do know that we will get to those. I'd like to pass it now to Gail Langley, who will lead our local panel. She's the Colorado Department of Local Affairs State Coordinator for the Colorado Main Street Program. Take it away, Gail.
Well, thank you so much, Delaney. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Okay. We had a few technical glitches on some calls earlier this morning. Well, let me do some quick introductions of the panelists that we're going to have here this afternoon. The first one, you can see all of their smiley faces on here, is Bianca Fisher. She's the Executive Director of the Downtown Greeley Development Authority, followed by Wendell Pryor, and he is the Director of Chaffee County Economic Development Center. And last is Angie Q. She's the Executive Director of the Lamar Partnership. And Lamar is one of our graduate communities in the Main Street program. So we are very proud to have her on here with a local perspective of what Lamar is doing. So I'm going to start with the first question here. I'm going to pose it to all three of you, and maybe we can start with Bianca first. And this came up on a call we had earlier today with our Main Street communities, which we also do every Wednesday. And I'm finding it's a critical piece of information to start thinking about recovery and adaptation as we move forward. So how are you in your community building a coordinated support network to assist you in these efforts moving forward? And Bianca, we'll start with you.
Great. Thanks so much for that question. We, in downtown Greeley, that's been a constant theme is adaptation and support. I found that we have, more than ever, it's interesting. I feel like in many ways, you know, this is a time of isolation and separation, but in many ways I've found I've never worked so closely with our city partners, with the chamber, with the SBDC, with our regional partners like Windsor and Loveland and Fort Collins. And I love the comment that was made earlier about R&D is you know, replicate and duplicate, but really learning from one another, because I think, again, we're all faced with a lot of similar challenges. Now, granted, all of our communities are really different, but what I've found is there's been tremendous value for us as an organization in our downtown community to rely on those partner organizations for support, especially early on. I think about all the funding that was coming down and for the PPP and EIDL loans, and really leaning on our SBDC partners. And then our city and our chamber worked together to create a grant fund. And that was a tremendous support to our downtown businesses. So really, again, leaning on the resources, the expertise, the support that our community partners and regional partners can provide us. I've never in my 10 years with the DDA have collaborated and partnered in the extent that we have throughout this experience.
Excellent. Well, Wendell, do you have a few comments to add to Bianca's?
I do. The Economic Development Corporation approached the county commissioners and suggested we create a Chaffee County Economic Recovery team. So for the last 8 or 9 weeks, we have been meeting as a team every day alongside the county health department to figure out the recovery. I think we were one of the 22 counties that submitted a variance to the state to get open, which we accomplished last week. But in addition to the roundtable members of local elected and appointed officials, we identified about 11 different industry teams that would come together periodically to talk about what the needs were and how the health department could help them open up. And so we were very intentional in identifying leaders in the community and thought leaders to work through that process. And we've developed a cohesive, coordinated effort with the business community to make sure that we got open in the right way. A couple of examples that have come out of that are presenting the findings from our entrepreneur, remote worker, and proprietor group this afternoon as soon as I get off this call. But one of the more interesting recommendations that is being implemented now came from a gentleman who's the clinical exercise physiologist and manager of the Heart of the Rockies Wellness Cardiac Rehab Program, who suggested we close off 2 streets of downtown in Salida, which happens to be the largest historic district in the state. That was approved yesterday by the Salida City Council and is an example, I think, of the creativity and opportunity that came as a result of our efforts. So we've got a united front of the business community working with local elected officials and the health department. And we've become kind of this laboratory of ideas to work with our downtowns to help bring the recovery.
Excellent answer, Wendell. I think you guys are really far ahead of where some other communities are in building that collaboration. And I might get back with you on that in just a minute. Angie, would you like to field this question as well about how you are developing a support system and network and leadership team in Lamar?
Yes, absolutely. So I can kind of echo what Bianca was just saying about networking with some of the local partners, such as our SBDC, our Southeast Colorado Enterprise Development. We've all really come together and put together some programs for the local businesses. The biggest one is a support fund that a local donor contributed $100,000 to. And we went out and really talked to some community members and got them to contribute to this fund also as some match money. So this fund has just built over time, and these businesses here have just been, so excited about it that they actually have some support locally. And it's because of that collaboration and that coalition that was put together to, join forces and get through this together. And I like the idea of adaptation versus recovery. And, and that's what this whole effort has been, is how are we going to adapt to what business is going to look like from here going forward.
Wonderful. Well, I'm going to pick back up on something Wendell just mentioned too, and circle back around to another question, and I'll field it to Bianca. How has your organization pivoted and adapted to some of these new changes and challenges? And do you have some specific examples that you could share?
Absolutely. The initial pivot for us was really information driven. I feel like a big part of our role shifted to communicator. Again, with everyone, there was a lot of information flying around. I think there was confusion, and I'm envious of Chaffee County when you talked about just a great partnership with your health departments. And in Weld County, there's been a little bit of tension with the state and then local leaders, and our businesses were really confused because the county was saying one thing, the city was saying one thing, the state was saying something else. And so I found our role shifting in that moment to really being a voice of information and support to our businesses. Which is, not something we do. We have a business group that we meet with once a month, but I found us needing to be a really active channel in that conversation. So that was really initially, but a big part of too, what we'd normally be coming into during the summer months is our event season. We put on Friday Fest every Friday throughout the summer. We were the state's first common consumption entertainment district. So we have folks who can go out and enjoy live music and enjoy their drinks on the plazas. So that's been a shift, and our staff person, Allison, has pivoted those events, and they're looking at virtual type experiences to support local musicians and artists. We are also a creative district certified by the state. So that's been a part of that too, is just wanting to support our creatives as well. And then also exploring it. I think a big thing too for me has been really being engaged more actively with our business community, because to the point someone else made earlier is we make an assumption that it's going to take $1 million and the world to kind of turn, but we actually endeavor to call, it was 128 of our businesses, our restaurants and retailers, and just check in with them to see what their needs were, and then to see how we could start filling the gaps and really monitor. And I think that's crucial. It seems so minuscule, but it was pivotal for us because I think we were making assumptions about what our businesses needed, and also about their financial position. And what we found is our businesses were, everyone was sorely impacted, but doing relatively okay. So that helped us strategize timing wise, because like I mentioned, the city and the chamber have partnered together to create a fund for grants. And obviously a lot of our businesses were able to take advantage of the PPP and EIDL loans. And so we were going to enroll a grant program, and actually that shifted the course of our decision making as well, to say, why don't we wait until that money runs dry and then see what shape our businesses are in and see what kind of needs they have. And then we started endeavoring, we're in the process right now of creating a marketing campaign and really looking at how can we be a voice for folks to remember to come downtown as businesses start opening up, to share about the safe practices that are happening, to share about who's opening and the innovative things that they're doing in new online stores and curbside pickups and collaborations and partnerships that are happening between the businesses. We can amplify that message with the resources that we have. So we're endeavoring into a big marketing campaign right now, and that's something new that we weren't planning on doing. So I'm sure there's going to be more of that to come, but that's kind of been our initial pivot thus far.
Excellent. It's nice to see that kind of collaboration and creativity and innovation happening in your downtown. Wendell, would you like to speak to that in a little bit more detail, following up on your previous response?
Sure. I think it is a nice compliment to what Bianca just mentioned. And if I would leave people with one thing, it's that I think through figuring out the response to the pandemic, it's a process. It's not a program. And what we learned in listening to our businesses, we conducted a couple of surveys that had good response from the business community. We conducted these Zoom meetings with different industry sectors with a preset agenda that asked questions to really get at solutions. So I think that was the one takeaway, is that you can't come in with any preconceived notions, so to speak. We also did a lot of R&D. Angie, we picked up on your loan program and offered that to the city of Salida, which was able to provide some grants to businesses. And looking forward, part of our strategy is to develop our own revolving loan fund through a USDA program that combined a program coming through the Electric Association, which is placed the match with the Heart of the Rockies buying some equipment. So hopefully by the end of the year, we'll have a revolving loan program in place that will help with the businesses that do survive this summer month. So that's part of our strategy, is to see if we can get them through the first half and then work with them on the second half.
Excellent. Angie, do you have anything you want to add to that about how Lamar has kind of pivoted and adapted to the new changes and challenges?
Sure. So I found our Main Street program has become a conduit for communication and education for the businesses, especially between communication with the city, with our public health. So I just felt like we kind of morphed into this role of being a support to the business, to being the hub of communication and disseminating information. And so it's been a real pivotal role for us just as an organization, but I think within the community, businesses and even community members are relying on us to be that voice for the businesses as well. So it's just been a great pivot for us within our community. And I think it's made us stronger as an organization. It's made our downtown stronger. It's just been a real growing experience to get through this pandemic. It's something that none of us ever planned on or expected, but I think things are happening the way they are for a reason. And I think we're gonna all become better because of it.
Absolutely. Well, I see we're getting just a little bit short on time, and like 10 more really great questions we wanted to get to, but I'm going to punt it back to Delaney and just ask if there is one last question out of this list that you really want to get at more than others, because we have about 4 minutes left before the Q&A. So I'll give it back to you, Delaney. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Gail. I think more than anything is just, you know, as somebody watching it inside of your community, you know, what are the words of wisdom you'd give to other communities dealing in this moment? Does anybody have anything to add to that?
I'll just leave kind of a quick remark. I think that's been important for me, and actually I've gotten to learn close hand. My husband actually owns a business in our downtown district too, so it's been fun to have a little bit of that perspective that's really feet on the ground. And I don't mean fun lightly in the sense of that it's been a fun season, but it's been a unique opportunity to learn from that adaptation. And one thing I would say, and Delaney, to your at the beginning, kind of flipping that word and reading it differently for me is redefining experience. So what we've all talked about it, the thing that makes downtown so unique and so wonderful are these experiences that we can have with our local business owners, with these events, with all of the programming and the people, and it's an experience. So for me, the biggest thing I think I would leave everyone with is just to start redefining what experience looks like. And it's one thing I loved that my husband posed to his staff yesterday. They said, you know, because they kept on getting stuck in the same box of trying to do the same thing or get, you know, try and make things kind of fit where they didn't really. He said, pretend like we were opening, it's a brewery that he owns. He said, pretend like we were opening this brewery today in the midst of this new world. How would we do business differently? And it completely changed their perspective and helped them think in a new light, in a new manner. And for me, running our organization, that was such a kind of moment for me. It's like, that's a great point. If I just took this job as executive director of our downtown, what were the initiatives I'd go after right away, as opposed to like, we keep doing the same thing over and over, or trying to make things fit that don't necessarily. So I would just say, redefine the experience.
Right. Yes, I think about that every day. This pandemic is really calling on us all to become better explorers every day. As we move to Q&A.
I was just going to say, utilize all of your resources. We managed to utilize the chambers for our outreach to the business community, and we jointly helped define the agenda, and that included the SBDC. But utilize all of the resources you have in the community and call some people to some leadership roles in businesses, so to lead industry groups.
That's great. As we transition to Q&A for the audience, really quickly, something I found interesting as a 25-year Gunnison resident out here on the western slope of Colorado, so I'm falling a little bit more in love with my community right now, which is a nice reward despite how hard some of the work is. So how, you know, are each of you falling in love with your communities more? And if you are right now, say aye.
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 Awesome. So that's a nice piece of it, and a little bit of a silver lining that we find in hard times. So let's go ahead and transition on to Q&A. Do we have some questions from the audience coming in? I'll pass it to you, Jamie.
Hi, I'm Jamie Bilsbach, and I am not seeing the Q&A question. So am I in the wrong window, or do we?
We may not have any Q&A coming in. We did have one come in here. And again, if you're listening in on the call and you have questions, now's the time to do it. We did have one question come in that we can read, and Jamie, I'll go ahead and read it. It is, a gentleman asked, it is projected that we may lose up to 40% of our rural businesses in several regions of rural Colorado due to economic distress with COVID-19. What strategies or ideas do you have to help address this immediate crisis? We did have a response from both Leslie Schaller and Bruce Katz. I'll go ahead and drop those into the chat function for everybody to read. But do any of you here, local panelists, have anything you'd like to add to that question around strategies or ideas to help address this immediate crisis?
I think this is, and I hate to use this term, but it's just the reality. I heard this term about 3 weeks ago, and it was brutally frank. And part of what we're going through and what this pandemic will do is kind of call the herd, so to speak. And I think we have to acknowledge that we are going to lose some businesses. And I recognize that some businesses made the pivot a lot earlier than others and figured out their business model. And if you hadn't done that, let's say by the 1st of May, as you anticipated opening at some point, then you may be stuck with, not getting back to the level you were at, and you may go out of business. And I think that's just a reality of the time that we live in. And that happens all the time with businesses.
One thing I'd love to add, if it's all right, Delaney, is to point out that if you had a good idea and a good business before COVID, it's still a good idea. And it's still potentially viable. I think Bianca really hit the nail on the head, though. It's just, you have to shift maybe how you deliver what it is that your business was. The music industry, radio has gone through all of these transitions too, where you really have to shift from how do we listen, how do we watch? Look at TV. We're all watching things online. We never could have imagined that 20 years ago. So we're just having to switch that. But if you had a good idea before, it doesn't mean that you have to pivot now. It does mean that the stakes are different and higher, but it doesn't mean to throw everything away either.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much, everybody. We know our main streets are so important to us. We've gone to the land of Neum Turks and come home to Main Street, Colorado. We know this is really the heart and soul of these communities, which is something Kathy LaPlante has pointed to throughout the calls today. I am going to pass it on to Jamie to go ahead and share some further resources for all of you and follow up.
Yes, and I want to say that we really do need to save our main streets and work with our main streets. So I think as community members, that's a main focus, and we have a lot of resources. So the Colorado Main Street program offers support for community-led downtown revitalization, and that website is on your screen, as well as Downtown Colorado Inc. And they're also helping with response and recovery due to COVID. And they have many calls that they're offering via webinars. And the next one is May 28th, and it's financial resource and sales tax fragility. And I know that affects not only small businesses, but cities and towns that are focused and can only be run based on sales tax. So there's a long journey to be had on that area. Next slide. And if you'd like the slides from today's session, you can go to eastcoloradosbdc.com, disaster relief. And that's Lisa's SBDC Center and very supportive. And then coloradosbdc.org/COVID has an amazing amount of resources for the COVID disaster. As a SBDC director, I'm on that site daily for links and support. And they have a lot of other resources besides just the federal PPP and Int'l. They have many other funding resources for all small businesses. Please look at that link. And I believe the list is over 100 now for support. And then startupcolorado.org has all sorts of resources related to entrepreneurship. And please take a time to go to their website. Next slide. And then to see this session, as well as previous recorded sessions, which have been incredible, go to Choose Colorado YouTube channel, and you can view those at your leisure. And if you still have questions, you can go to Startup Colorado at colorado.edu and email them. And then final slide. They also have crisis solutions for entrepreneurs. They have amazing podcasts and links. So please go to startupcolorado.org and /podcast and subscribe to their various podcasts. And finally, we really like to have you join us next Wednesday, 2 weeks from now, June 10th. The Western Slope calls are at 1 o'clock and the Eastern calls are at 3 p.m. So please Join us again and tell your friends and small businesses and community members. Thank you so much for joining in this call.